Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's now 2 o'clock, so it's time for me to start this hearing session into the examination of the Maidstone Local Plan Review. Can I just check, can everybody hear me okay? Yeah, good, thank you. Just to introduce myself, for those who've not attended previous sessions, my name's David Spencer. I'm the Planning Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to carry out the independent examination of the Maidstone Local Plan Review. Can I please at this stage ask people to ensure that mobile phones are switched off or on their silent setting, please? And can I inquire of the council? I don't think we're due a fire alarm today, so if the bell does or the alarm goes off, can the council advise us what we need to do, please?
Good afternoon, sir. Yes, we're not expecting a fire alarm today, so if the alarm does sound, please leave this room down the stairs through the foyer and exit onto the main square just outside the building and await further instructions. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, you may have been advised these hearing sessions are being simultaneously recorded. Are we getting feedback? So that is something that's happening. It's something that the inspectorate encourages. So I hope nobody's got any issues with that. The one thing that we will need to observe is that for people who are watching the recording, to pick up what's been said, if people round the table can use microphones, please, when making your points to me. Obviously, this afternoon's hearing session follows on from considerable discussion at stage one into this afternoon's topic of the Lidsing garden community proposal in the north of the borough. I'm not going back over some of the ground that we covered over those 2 days of discussion. This afternoon's session, first part of this afternoon's session, focuses specifically on highways matters and in relation to the additional evidence that's been produced following the stage one hearing sessions. And for those of you who are here this morning, and for the benefit of those who weren't, I'm going to be running this afternoon session in a similar manner. Whilst I appreciate people have a right to be heard, what I'm going to do for this afternoon session is I'm not allowing elements of kind of back and forth discussion. We've had quite a bit of that as part of the stage one hearings. So what I'm going to do in the first instance is give the council the first sort of opportunity to explain the additional work that's been undertaken in relation to Lidsing since the stage one hearings, together with the site promoter. I then want to hear from National Highways in relation to their particular interests, not least Junction 4 of the M2. And then I want to turn and hear from Kent County Council in terms of their submissions and responses to my supplementary questions. And then I will hear in turn from those seated to my left, who have obviously raised concerns about the additional transport evidence and the overall approach in respect of highways to this particular aspect and proposal of the plan. Once I've heard from people on that side of the table, I'll then give the council the opportunity for rebuttal. So everyone will be heard, but there isn't, unfortunately, I don't think there's time for a lot of lengthy back and forth and debating. Once I've heard finally from the council, I'll obviously then leave these hearing sessions to reflect on what I've heard as part of these discussions. I think that sort of concludes my introduction for this session. As I say, these are being recorded, so it would be helpful, I think, for myself, people in the room, and anybody watching the recordings, if those who are going to speak, if they could briefly introduce themselves using the microphone. And if I can start with the council's team on my right, please.
Good afternoon, sir. Yes, I'm Megan Thomas, King's Counsel, representing Maidstone Planning Authority.
Good afternoon, sir. Jason Lewis, Director of Transport Planning for Stantec, representing Maidstone Borough Council. Good afternoon. John Wild, Director at C&A Consulting Engineers Transport for the promoter.
Good afternoon. Jenny Wigley, King's Counsel, representing Kent County Council as Highway Authority. Thank you.
Good afternoon, sir. Brendan Wright, representing Kent County Council as Local Highway Authority.
Good afternoon. Hazel Morton, assisting Kevin Bown on behalf of National Highways.
And Kevin Bown, National Highways.
Good afternoon. It's Catherine Smith representing Medway Council.
Good afternoon, sir. David Mosley from Countryside Properties.
Julie Davis, CPRE Kent.
Councillor Bob Hinder representing Boxley Ward.
Councillor Clive English, leader of the Liberal Democrat Group, Maidstone Borough Council.
Councillor Vanessa Jones, Boxley Ward, Borough Councillor.
David McMurtry from Motion, representing Bredhurst.
Afternoon, sir. Alex Shattock of Council, representing Bredhurst as well.
Good afternoon, sir. Chris Shepherd, representing Boxley Parish Council.
Good afternoon. Anne Brindle, representing Boxley Parish Council.
Thank you for that. So in respect of this afternoon session, obviously additional evidence was provided in response to various matters that were raised out of the stage 1 hearings. I'm grateful for those who've responded to my supplementary questions and provided additional material. I think we'll come on to that shortly. And I'm also obviously mindful that there is work in progress. There is a statement of common ground with National Highways. It went in as examination document 98, but I think that's a work in progress and a further iteration. I was advised this morning will be making its way into the examination. In terms of the additional work that has been undertaken, I say similar to questions I had for Heathlands this morning. If I can start with the council, please, and then that'll probably lead to further contributions from Mr. Wild. I think in terms of understanding whether the evidence helps to demonstrate at this kind of strategic kind of plan-making level that the spatial strategy as it relates to Lidsing, the infrastructure requirements, including potential mitigation, have been identified insofar as they can be, or reasonably can be, and are reasonably achievable, within a caveat that obviously more detail will be required at subsequent stages. Now, we also heard a lot this morning about the potential of the implications of the change from Department for Transport Circular 213 to the new 01/2022, in terms of moving away from the predict and provide to the manage and monitor approach. So again, the council and its partner may wish to say a bit more about that in terms of its bearing on Lidsing. So is it Mr. Lewis?
Thank you very much, sir. On behalf of Maidstone Borough Council, Stantec has reviewed the additional evidence within the EDs 81, 82, 91 to 95 and 98. And on behalf of the LPAs, and following correspondence with colleagues at KCC and National Highways, we have concluded that, in our view, the evidence base provided by the site promoters is robust and proportionate to this stage of the plan-making process. Maidstone Borough Council has proposed main modifications to address some of the concerns raised by the highway authorities to date. It's important to consider DFT Circular 122, as you noted, which was adopted in December 2022. This builds upon Circular 2/2013 and responds to the 6th carbon budget and the government's legal obligations to reach net zero by 2050. It also tackles the significant challenges falling from COVID and Brexit and the economy, and works to bring an orderly management of how development sites come forward into this uncertain future. As such, there's a clear direction in the new circular to move away from a predict and provide approach towards vision and validate, including a far more proactive approach to sustainable transport, and onwards using monitor and manage to promote sustainable strategies for new sites. So Maidstone Borough Council supports Circular 122 and is encouraged that it aligns with the Council's climate emergency. The circular is clear that National Highways will work with local councils to adopt the circular in plan making, and in this regard we propose main modifications to policy in the IDP to set out a monitor and manage framework. Alongside the highway authorities, Maidstone Borough Council has asked the site promoters to give their view on how the new circular has been taken into account. Maidstone Borough Council, alongside KCC and National Highways, is satisfied that the Lidsing site accords with the new circular. Maidstone Borough Council has sought to agree common ground with KCC and National Highways through a statement of common ground. This has followed submission of a number of new technical evidence updates by the site promoter, which have been reviewed and broadly agreed by National Highways and KCC. It is noted that there is also work ongoing in respect of the A229 junctions with the M20 Junction 6 and M2 Junction 3. There is an agreed statement of common ground with National Highways, updated from ED 98, ready for signing, and we have reached a broad agreement with KCC on the technical elements of the KCC Highways Statement of Common Ground. Stantec, on behalf of Maidstone Borough Council, is satisfied that the additional evidence presented is appropriate for this plan-making stage. To my right is Mr. John Wild from CNA Consulting, and he's available to answer any in-depth technical questions about the additional evidence base after the other parties have had chance to speak. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. As I say, I will bring in other people as in due course, but just a clarification from the council and/or from CNA in terms of the note on interim phasing. I mean, is the intention to bring forward potential changes to the policy or the plan to reflect what's in that note, or is it still where I thought we'd got to after the stage one hearings, that phase two is very much the trigger for delivering the east-west link and the connection or the spur off Junction 4 of the M2. Wasn't clear of what's being proposed now as more of a kind of a splitting out and more detail within phase two within the policy.
I'm happy to answer that, sir. No, you're quite correct that the policy remains as, through the main modifications, will remain the same as you envisaged coming out of stage one, that phase two of the development will be the period in which the east-west link road connection to M2 Junction 4 and the bridge crossing are delivered. The phasing note that you refer to that's produced simply introduced the possibility of a interim solution to allow earlier delivery of primarily the east-west link road in that phasing. So it sits within phase two. It is only a possibility. It's not a necessity. It really is just to ensure that we have confidence in the deliverability of that plan, given the time periods that can be involved in interaction with the National Highways network and new bridge crossings. So very much the policy remains the delivery of the infrastructure in phase two, as was identified coming out of stage one. Does that answer your question adequately?
That's helpful. And then in terms, it's probably again yourself, Mr. Wild, and I'm going to be hearing from this from others around the room in terms of the issue about the impact on the road network to the south. I mean, the policy, when it was originally submitted for examination, included a line about measures to prevent rat running to the south. There's again, following the stage one hearings, a move within the policy to, I think, to provide more kind of clarity on what is being envisaged in terms of measures, particularly for Bredhurst, but also more widely, I know this is a concern, still a residual concern for many, and so I'm going to hear about it shortly. You've done a further note, I think, as part of the response to my supplementary questions that identifies a number of potential options or measures, and I think again is that an evidence that triggers further modifications to the policy in terms of providing further detail. What's your submission, Mr. Wild, on that evidence and the status it should have?
So I don't believe it's envisaged that that requires a policy change. The intention of the submission to you in response to your supplementary questions was to provide some additional confidence of the range of measures that were available on a graduated scale to respond to what could be the implications with respect to the rural road network. And as you've touched on already and discussed at length, monitor and manage approach that's being discussed, it's critical that any interventions, particularly in Bredhurst, are proportionate to the impact that is going to be or could be occurring. Obviously, the principal objective of the scheme is that the East-West Link Road is the principal mitigating benefit with respect to impacts on Bredhurst, but the evidence base has consistently accepted that it is important to monitor and ensure that that is deriving all of the benefits that are anticipated. And the supplementary note you see simply sets out to give some context to what could be applied, as I say, in a graduated sense, with relatively modest interventions moving through to more sort of more substantial interventions. But what's absolutely critical is that there's engagement with the community to ascertain the best way of doing that and the most effective, because it is possible that actually some of the residual benefits will be sought even if the link road achieves its objectives. So we're keen that and I believe Maester may wish to speak to this, that the policy as written provides enough guidance and indication towards the fact that the traffic calming is assessed and implemented as appropriate. But I don't know if Maester wants to clarify their position on that.
Thank you, Mr. Wild. I think we will be coming back to this, so you may want to respond to points that are made around the table. If I can move to National Highways next, and Mr. Bown. Obviously, I've read ED 98. My interpretation of it is that the general kind of progress is positive, but I just wanted to be clear on whether, similar to our discussion this morning in relation to the M20, whether the M2 junction proposals similarly need ultimately a stage 1 road safety audit as well. I'm slightly unclear on this point.
Yes, sir, thank you. Yes, it's a similar story to this morning. So good progress has been made. There's been good working engagement across all parties, including the promoter, the council and the county council. So we're generally content with the progress to date, but as this morning, there needs to be a rounding up process leading to modifications to the plan, policy, its text and the daughter documents such as the IDP, etc., and the production in due course of the monitor and manage strategy and the IDP, etc. Now it's interesting that this morning Heathlands is a site that has a lot of impacts on a lot of junctions, but most of the mitigations in themselves are quite small. Lidsing, on the other hand, is from our perspective on the SRN, is a scheme that has a far more focused impact and leading to a more major intervention mitigation required, particularly with regards to Junction 4. So, you know, two allocations, broadly similar, but in terms of how you will pursue them, slightly nuanced and different. But the process will be the same, that we're working together, we've got a long way, there's still some more work to be done to dot the I's and cross the T's. That then itself then is wrapped up in a parallel process whereby once you know the impacts and the mitigations and the what, the where, the when and how, etc. for these larger individual sites, as part of the wrapping up of the whole local plan, you'll be doing exactly the same for the cumulative impacts of both the allocations and the rest of the local plan, where sites aren't allocated but you know development's going to occur in certain areas. So again, all of that work is ongoing. It's in a good place. We see no reason why it can't be successfully concluded to a timetable that no doubt you will give us. And that will also be wrapped up in an update to the Statement of Common Ground. And what we've done in other local plans is effectively that Statement of Common Ground is almost the end product, and it gives that list of the what, the where, the how, the when, the who, the governance, all the documents that have been relied on. So they're all in one place. So for now and in the future, any party can go to it and go, okay, I understand what you did, why you did it, etc. Now, as part of that local plan wrapping up process, Lidsing is more affected than Heathlands in terms of it will both have direct impacts that it will directly mitigate. And as an inspector, you're familiar with the likes of Grampian conditions, so you can say, right, by this point in the the delivery process, you will have done X, Y, or Z. You've also got other mitigations that Lidsing is likely to contribute, which are the cumulative impacts, and they'll be local plan led. So again, it's that twin tracking approach that can be embraced in the monitor and manage. And as we spoke this morning, it will be, again, the things that just have to happen anyway, because they, like a site access, for example, you can't not have a site access, or they're things where it's sustainable transport, you're encouraging behaviour change or just behaviour in the first place, so you deliver them early. And there'll be those items that it can wait a while because the impacts aren't going to be felt for some time, and as part of monitor and manage and this move from predict and provide to vision and validate, you will review, do we still need this, or is there a better way of achieving the same outcome, or because of some other process we don't need this mitigation anymore. So that's the kind of the rounding up that's where we're heading. As I say, we see no reason why we can't reach that. We're content for that framework to be via the major modifications, etc. And you see that golden thread through the plan, and then for the detail to come forward via SPD applications, etc. And that will also reflect the fact that the world is forever moving on. There's always government consultations, etc., etc. Policy can change. Therefore, we're content that we've got as far as we need to at a strategic level, subject to, the work that my colleague will describe in a moment. And then we can follow that process through and add the detail that's needed at the appropriate time, SPD or application stage, which will also include reviews of evidence, because the evidence will need to be the right evidence when the application comes forward, not necessarily rely on stuff that was done for today, as it were. If I can pass to my colleague.
Yeah, so just a couple of brief points to add with regard to specific submissions made. Sorry. Yeah. So just a couple of specific points to add on particular documents that have been submitted in support of this particular proposed allocation. So ED 91 talks about the process that has been undertaken with reconciling the issues that we discussed at stage 1 around the KCC strategic model versus the AIM-SUM models. A number of different elements of discussion have taken place on that, and we have now reached an agreed position with KCC in regards to how that work is to be taken forward. There is more to do on that as part of the next stage, and we have agreed a methodology for that, because certain of that modelling work will be dependent on assumptions that will be fleshed out further as part of the SPD development of the site. So on that basis, we are as National Highways content with it insofar as it pertains to the strategic network. And the other document to touch on is ED 93, which is the phasing. This was the element of work that we discussed previously as requiring further clarification from our perspective, as in terms of exactly when the changes to Junction 4 would be needed, because there was some uncertainty at the stage 1 over that, and a number of people did raise that independently as a concern. As you will have seen from that document, there is now a degree of flexibility with regard to when that can be delivered within stage 2, so that if, as my colleague has described, if things change to the point where it is needed more quickly, we now have some evidence that that is actually achievable, which we did not previously have in front of us. That gives further comfort from a technical perspective that not only does a solution exist, but there is some flex in how it can be delivered that can react to changes on the ground. And I believe that will be particularly important when you consider that in the light of ED 94 and the commentary around the other local road network issues, because the two are very closely interlinked. Therefore, we need to be happy that those two are going to reflect one another correctly.
Thank you. I sort of recognise Mr. Bowen, you sort of say in terms of a time frame for seeing some of this additional work that's required at this stage to its conclusion. I mean, I could set a timetable, but that may not be realistic or feasible. So I think I would need to be guided by the council and or yourselves after this hearing session as to kind of what sort of time frame you might be looking at. I say for Heathlands this morning, it felt reasonably close. I'm getting an impression for Lidsing it's a little bit more involved. There's a little bit more that still needs to be worked through. Would that be is that fair, or have I misinterpreted that?
As I suggested, so Heathlands is more impacts but lesser impacts. Lidsing is more focused. So the work to be done is not dissimilar. It's just the nature of the work. It's more detailed in its nature, but the time taken to do it, I suspect, will be similar.
Thank you for that. If I can now turn to Kent County Council, and in terms of your position in relation to Lidsing and the additional material and evidence. Obviously, I believe your organisation's concern is more the immediate kind of road network. I've alluded already to the network south of the Lidsing site, but would it be Miss Wigley in the first instance?
Yes, sir.
Introduce and then hear from Mr. Wright?
Exactly so, sir. Yes, Kent County Council has some outstanding concerns surrounding the phasing and sequencing of the East-West Link Road and how that interacts with the M2 Junction 4 improvement, and the effect that those will have on the need for and the timing of mitigation in the villages to the south. And even with the link road in place, which we understand and accept will have hopefully have some mitigating effect on that. But even with that in place, we consider there's likely to be a residual impact on the villages. So to that end, Kent has proposed some wording in terms of draft main modifications to the council, and I'll hand over to Mr. Wright just to take you through those and the rationale for them, if that's acceptable. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to highlight from the outset that the County Council has worked closely with the site promoter, National Highways and Maidstone Borough Council following your Stage 1 report, sir. which required work proportionate to plan making in relation to highway mitigations in Bredhurst, Boxley and on the wider highway network. The evidence that has now been submitted has really reinforced the imperative of achieving both timely and orderly delivery of the access via M2 Junction 4, of the East-West Link Road, and of the off-site mitigations, including those within Bredhurst and Boxley. You'll have seen, sir, in our responses to your supplementary questions that the phasing and access strategy in technical note ED93 has raised particular concerns in how it has proposed an interim phase 2 site access arrangement at M2 Junction 4. This is an interim arrangement that has not been the subject of any junction capacity modelling or a safety audit. Importantly, the interim arrangement would have the effect of introducing direct road connectivity between M2 Junction 4 and Maidstone Road in advance of the East-West Link Road being provided. This has implications on route choice behaviours amongst existing road users in how it would facilitate the use of roads through Bredhurst and Boxley for journeys between M2 Junction 4 and the Maidstone area. Further, the concern that the County Council has raised in relation to ED94, the note on the impact on the rural network, has been the lack of evidence on what interventions could be implemented in Bredhurst and Boxley in order to meet the requirements of MPPF paragraph 110 regarding mitigation of impacts. That omission has been partially addressed within the site promoter response to your supplementary questions, the document entitled Rural Lane Interventions that was referred to earlier. This has provided some examples of potential interventions in Bredhurst. And the County Council accepts that there is scope for interventions of the nature suggested to be implemented at that location. Having said that, in the absence of greater clarity on the scope and form of mitigations in Bredhurst, we do not accept the view that mitigation will not also be required at Boxley. We would also add to that timely delivery of mitigations at junctions across the wider network, and these will include but not be limited to the conceptual proposals that were listed in ED93 table 3.1, sir. Given that these will also be pertinent to journey times, route choice, and the impacts that might be felt in Bredhurst and Boxley. So the County Council is of the view that the policy should be modified in the interest of effectiveness and soundness to ensure that mitigations can be delivered at the point they are needed based on the currently available evidence. Those modifications more specifically would involve the delivery and phasing timetable that's within the policy. So we require the preliminary phase to include the delivery of those off-site highway mitigations already evidenced, namely those in ED93, table 3.1, and the Walderslade Woods Fostington Way junction that was identified in ED53B1. We would require phase 1 to require completion and delivery of the East-West Link Road In other words, in advance of any interim M2 Junction 4 arrangement. And phase 1 would also need to include any other off-site junction mitigations that may be demonstrated to be necessary. In phase 2, we would require that timetable to require delivery of mitigation in Bredhurst and Boxley, given that that will be the point at which any residual impacts in those locations will be apparent and evidenced. Also in phase 2 would need to be any other off-site junction mitigations that have been demonstrated to be necessary. And so if I could just finally turn to the point on monitor and manage and the circular 122. That circular is primarily aimed at the strategic highway network, but the County Council accepts that the principles within it can be applied to the local highway network. We are supportive of an approach that places sustainable development at its heart in terms of moving from predict and provide to a vision-led methodology. We also recognise that monitor and manage will enable assumptions to be revisited as new evidence becomes available. So particularly on matters such as the influence of the East-West Link Road on routing behaviours by road users. Monitor and manage does not, however, negate the need for the policy content to be informed by the evidence that is currently available. This evidence indicates that mitigations at junctions will be needed at the outset. The modifications, therefore, that I've described are regarded to be necessary to ensure the policy is effective and sound. Thank you.
Thank you. So, Mr. Wright, just so I'm clear, you're directing me to document ED 93 in table 3.1, I think, in terms of a list of junctions at that location. You also referenced and named a junction, I think, is covered in ED 53 big 1, and my pen wasn't quick enough, so you just remind me again of that name of that junction.
Of course, sir. That is the Walderslade Woods Fostington Way junction.
Thank you. And in terms of, you referenced there phase 2, other mitigation in Bredhurst and Boxley together, any other off-site junction mitigation. Going back to the points that were discussed earlier, in light of the additional submissions from the site promoter, as part of that phase 2 reference, is the County Council looking for further detail, specificity of what that mitigation might look like, or is a reference to mitigation in Bredhurst and Boxley sufficient to be identified in that kind of phase 2 time period?
At that point, we would expect much greater specificity, really, because the impacts will be fully known, so there would be opportunity at that point to work up the details in full.
Thank you. So just to labour the points, I'm clear. It's not saying it for the purpose of policy now, from Kent County Council's perspective, it needs to say there needs to be a narrowing or a pinch point at location X or deflection at point Y. Those are kind of potential tools to be worked up. I think picking up Mr. Wild's point about potential, the potential community involvement and engagement in any kind of mitigation measures that are developed.
Yeah, it would have been our strong preference for the measures to have been defined in detail, because clearly that categorically demonstrates deliverability. We're not at that point yet. We certainly, based on the evidence we have to hand at this point, we certainly recognise the importance of engagement with the local community on what those measures should be. So, at this point we don't have that level of detail, but I think there's a need for robustness within the policy to ensure that once that detail has been clarified, that timely delivery is achieved.
Thank you for that. I've got no further questions or points I want to raise with Kent County Council. So I indicated I'd then hear in sequence from those who still have residual concerns about where this allocation is going in terms of its highways impacts. In terms of a logical order or sequence, I'm just wondering whether it's given the further written material that's before me, whether I hear from Bredhurst Parish Council and Motion Transport in the first instance, and then I'll come back to Boxley Parish, and then I'll hear from the other participants around the table. So is it Mr. Shattuck, please?
Thank you, sir. I'll start with Circular 0122, which you raised specifically, and then I'll turn to our issues with the new evidence, and then I'll pass over to Mr. McMurtry for the more technical points. Beginning with the circular first, I've got 2 points on the circular, one relating to paragraph 26 of that circular, and then paragraph 15. So first point, paragraph 26. Paragraph 26 says, the MPPF prescribes that transport issues should be considered from the earliest stages of plan making. So, sir, we say this is consistent with our interpretation of paragraph 110 of the MPPF, which you'd have seen in our written submissions, and we say this is a clear warning against pushing consideration of mitigation measures further down the line, which we say is what you're being invited to do today. That phrasing, earliest stages of plan making, doesn't occur in the previous circular, 02/2013, and we say that's because the 2012 MPPF that was extant at the time of the previous circular did not include the paragraph 110 requirement to ensure at the allocation stage that transport impacts can be mitigated, which is what we now see. So we would say there's been a shift in national policy towards a more precautionary, early stage approach to mitigating impacts, prevention and not cure. Second point on the new circular, paragraph 15, this is the focus on monitor and manage. We say it's clear from the circular at paragraph 15 that monitor and manage is supported in the very specific context of mitigation measures that increase capacity, which of course makes sense. You don't want to accidentally encourage increased road use through increased capacity, extra lanes on the motorway and so on. But increasing capacity is only one type of mitigation. The limited support for monitor and manage in the context of increasing network capacity, we say, is not a free pass to avoid assessing impacts and setting out mitigation from the earliest possible stage, including mitigation that does not relate to capacity, but is, for example, intended to change road user behaviour. In our view, while of course there needs to be some flexibility, the prevention of assessed negative impacts is better than trying to cure them after they arise. Turning now to our issues with the new evidence, I won't repeat the detail of our written submissions. You know we place emphasis on paragraph 110 of the MPPF, and I'm informed there was some discussion of that this morning. The question for you, sir, is, in light of the new material submitted, has the promoter ensured that any significant impacts can be mitigated in line with what paragraph 110 says? We say the answer to that question is still no, even after the new material that's been submitted, because we still don't know what the impacts will be on the villages, or indeed what the mitigation will be, because the required work still hasn't been done.
And that fact is reflected in many places in the evidence. It's a golden thread through the promoter's evidence, this lack of certainty. And to their credit, the promoter's always been very upfront about this. They haven't done the work yet, but we say that lack of certainty should be given significant weight today. And we say if you can't show a lack of severe impact through a robust evidence base, the allocation is unsound. Now, in response to our concerns, the promoter says first they need to consult with the local community before committing to any form of mitigation. And they also say the level of detail that we ask for isn't necessary at this stage. And I'll take both those points one at a time. On community consultation, we would agree that there needs to be community consultation, but there's no reason why this could not have been done in advance of today. If they'd done the work and set out their proposals, then we'd be here today talking about some firm proposals with the benefit of the community's views. The technical detail would perhaps be yet to be fleshed out, but at least the proposals would be on the table for us to talk about. The lack of community consultation is a symptom of the lack of certainty which arises from the lack of analysis. On the question of detail and what's needed for this stage, we don't dispute that the level of detail today needs to be proportionate to the strategic level of planning that we're concerned with, and we accept that you must bear in mind the potential for further detailed work to be undertaken later. But the MPPF tells us we have to ensure at the allocation stage that the impacts can be mitigated. And in order to ensure that the impacts can be mitigated, there does need to be a reasonably full assessment of what those impacts are actually going to be in order to know what mitigation will be applied. And we don't see that in any of the work that's been done so far. And again, the promoter has been very upfront about this. They accept they don't have a firm idea of what the impacts on Bredhurst will be, which is why they accept there might be a need for mitigation, but they can't say what it will be, they don't know. Turning to the stage 2 responses specifically, Bredhurst has carefully considered the promoter's stage 2 response, and we don't think that what's been provided gives the required comfort at this stage regarding potential severe impacts. In Appendix B to the promoter stage 2 submissions, the promoter has essentially set out a list of generic mitigation measures, often in an urban context like Maidstone or Oxford, which you'll see from the photos, sir. These include shared roundabouts, shared surface roundabouts and the like. But what the promoter hasn't yet done is assessed how this would apply to Bredhurst or the other villages, given their specific constraints. And to be fair to them, they don't claim to do that. Mr. Wilde very clearly said just now that these measures were just provided to you to give you additional context. But we say, without any kind of assessment, and not at the planning application level of detail, not at the SPD level of detail, but without any kind of assessment, some preliminary work on what's needed, there's no comfort that anything on that list can be done effectively. And importantly, we say Bredhurst itself is constrained in terms of adding more traffic calming measures, which the promoter's evidence doesn't grapple with. Bredhurst has many traffic calming measures already in place. It has no street lighting, which is a KCC requirement for more traffic calming measures, and the roads need to be of a particular width in order to let tractors through, which would make narrowing them difficult. So an abstract list of possible interventions without any meaningful application to the facts on the ground, we say is insufficient even at this level of plan making, even at this early stage. So on that basis, we say the policy is not sound, and in order to be sound, we agree with KCC there need to be specific mitigation measures for Bredhurst in the policy, and they need to be there right at the start. So that's the overview. I'll turn now to Mr. McMurtry for the technical detail.
Thank you. Yes, I'll try not to repeat myself because a number of points have been raised by my colleague here. I do believe that whilst a lot of additional information has been provided, which is provides more context and information. In a way, the more detail leads to more uncertainty as to what should or could be provided. My colleague here has mentioned that Bredhurst in particular has no street lighting or very limited street lighting. A lot of the measures that have been suggested are appropriate to an urban context, less so to a rural context. Now, the additional information does reference more robust measures, such as road closures, ANPR systems, which have been not entirely discounted, but discouraged. But I do believe that more robust measures are the only way to address any impact. Road closures need to be given very careful consideration so as not to affect local residents and do the job that they're intended to do. ANPR systems have been employed throughout the country very successfully to avoid rat running within urban and rural context, and that should be very much explored further. So I think that a lot of the measures are simply inappropriate for the context of Bredhurst. Boxley, very similarly, should be considered. It doesn't seem to have given as much regard in the most recent paper, but the same issues apply there. Both need to be given due consideration. Just drawing back onto comments that Mr. Wright had mentioned about when the east to west link should be introduced, and I agree that it needs to be implemented from a very early stage to avoid rat running becoming commonplace, and people will be set in their ways, and all that would occur is that people would use those roads with insufficient mitigation to dissuade them from doing so, which would be more difficult to alter and amend at a later date. And without certainty from the east to west link road, improvements to the roundabout, which in some ways the interim solution could just encourage more use of Bredhurst, travelling through Bredhurst. So that needs due consideration. I don't want to talk about modelling really in any detail because I know that's less relevant to today's discussion, and I mentioned that a lot of the stage 1 hearing, but I do just want to draw on some of the key points. There may be some disagreement on the nature of the modelling and the outcomes, but I think most people would agree that there will be congestion on the road network, and even with the eventual Junction 4 in place, there will still be congestion on the road network, as well as with the east to west link road, which is why a host of mitigation measures in Table 3.1 have been suggested. I think that just highlights that this network is congested at the moment and will continue to be so with future development, and I think it's important just to reiterate that there are a number of other developments that are coming forward within this locality which will create hundreds of houses that will add a material amount of traffic to the network, and of course that is included in the modelling, but it just reinforces the fact that the future will be a congested network like it is today, which will encourage rat running. It's just a common occurrence. As KCC have noted, Mr. Wright, that there just is insufficient evidence to demonstrate that rat running will not cause unacceptable impact to local roads. The one thing I will just mention further about the modelling is the use of cost penalties, and acknowledgement in the promoter's evidence that they are manual and artificial in ways, in that the user gets to implement those cost penalties. And I mention that solely because my concern, and concern all along at stage 1, is that too much emphasis is put on the east-to-west link road to move traffic away from local roads, and we don't really have a true picture of what the impact can be on local roads. And with insufficient evidence of what the impact can be, coupled with mitigation that, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't quite address that impact, we are still in the dark as to really what the impact on local roads can be. And again, Mr. Wright has mentioned this at quite some length, and I do concur with his findings. Just to pick up on the monitor and manage approach, I do agree that it is an approach that should be used in many contexts, particularly from a junction capacity point of view. As my colleague has mentioned, it is appropriate in some circumstances, and I indeed myself haven't employed it on development proposals. But here, when we're considering the local impact, it's a very different ballgame to junction capacity and trying to reduce traffic flow. You can dissuade people from using a car to travel by public transport, but when we're talking about routing on the network, it's an entirely different thing to address, and I don't believe that monitor and manage is the right approach to that. Just harking back to the phasing, as I just mentioned, I think it's essential that the east to west link, which would appear, and I accept, will assist in addressing some rat running issues but not entirely address it, needs to be implemented at a very early stage, as does improvements to the M4 junction 4, sorry, of the M2. And without full mitigation, rat running will be prevalent, and due consideration must be given to robust measures, as I mentioned, ANPR, road closures, as the only way of really addressing this. And ultimately, as I said at the start of my speech, the additional measures and information in many ways create more uncertainty because they're not appropriate for the context of particularly Bredhurst and Boxley in the same manner. Yeah, I think that's it. Thank you, sir.
I mean, I've heard from Kent County Council this afternoon. Their submission is the East-West Link moves into phase 1. I think it was previously earmarked for phase 2. Under that scenario, if it was in phase 1, would it be legitimate to implement the East-West Link and then review and see where matters rest in terms of mitigation for Bredhurst or Boxley, or is that not an appropriate or sound approach?
I think, and Mr. Wright did touch on the fact that there will be existing rerouting of the network, and the interim roundabout solution could actually encourage existing users to travel through Bredhurst. So I do agree that including at phase 1 is a material benefit and would dissuade more traffic from using local roads, but I don't think it entirely addresses the issue. And I think I mentioned the cost penalties and the way the modelling has been run. I don't think we have a clear picture of what that rat running will be, and I think the uncertainty, even with the East-West Link road in place, requires more information, more detail, more robust measures. Although I do concur that moving it to phase 1 clearly would create a betterment to it being in phase 2.
Thank you for that. Can I bring in other people? So I think probably if I bring in Borough Councillor Jones, I think I did say I would then hear from Boxley, and then I'll come back to the other people further down the line. So Councillor Jones, please.
Thank you, sir. I'm speaking on behalf of all residents across Boxley Ward, and I wish to draw your attention to a few points in the recent submissions. Firstly, ED 93, 2.2.2, 600 houses now being proposed at stage 1 could well coincide with the Gibraltar Farm development of 450 houses, which could be approved in the coming months. This would result in 1,050 houses using roads with little or no changes to them at all. The proposals would be particularly bad for Hempstead and Lordswood, plus all neighbouring areas. The upgrade of the single lane farm track for vehicles joining Maidstone Road is not workable. The road exits onto the Browver Hill, and only 75 metres away there is another application with Medway Council at Blowerswood for 88 houses, which also exits onto Maidstone Road. The existing narrow farm track is immediately adjacent to a public right-of-way, KH54. No mention has been made of this anywhere, it actually abuts the track that's there at the moment. So should that track be widened, I don't know quite what would happen to the public right-of-way. 3.1.9, 3.1.10, it's not satisfactory for the promoter to state that a new link road and interventions in Bredhurst will mean that no mitigation is needed in Boxley. If no mitigation was forthcoming in Boxley, it would be disastrous for the village and also for Sandling, who exit onto the main road just south of Boxley at Grange Lane. Both would be impacted greatly. As previously mentioned, in technical note 196225, all mitigations mentioned for Bredhurst have not considered that they all require streetlights. Photos at Fig figure 4.3, 4.4, all show street lights. So all the examples given show street lights. Bredhurst does not have street lights, and nor does Bredhurst want street lights. Wider build-outs and a pedestrian refuge that's been mentioned in the centre of the road at 4.2.4 are again out of the question. KCC have always told Bredhurst Parish Council that the width of the road must accommodate combine harvesters. Indeed, the promoter of Lidsing still farms at Bredhurst, so how would he get a combine to his fields if there's physical structures in the middle of roads? The example of the proposed measures at Fig 46, 47, 48, 49, all the way through, they're all examples in urban settings and in towns. They're not in villages. This document states that Bredhurst has minor to moderate traffic calming. This is inaccurate. It's extensive traffic calming. The whole road through Bredhurst has speed humps every few metres. And actually, KCC have confirmed separately to Bredhurst Parish Council, part of our Kent Highway Improvement Plan, in an email dated to Bredhurst Parish Council on the 20th of April this year, that no more traffic calming can be implemented without without street lights. So they've said themselves that there is nothing that they can do. Lastly, the example given at Castle Lane, Leybourne, again, this is a semi-urban area with lighting along the entire road. And the talk of roundabouts in Bredhurst, which would look dreadful in the village, not to mention the land it requires. I mean, are we going down the compulsory purchase route? I mean, how can they physically fit a roundabout in a tiny little lane? I don't know. It feels as though the people who have drafted these documents have not actually visited Bredhurst and have just listed random mitigation measures that are not appropriate for a village setting, and the measures they have suggested have not taken the needs of the wider community in Medway, Lordswood, Walderslade, Boxley or Sandlin into account. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Indicated next I'd hear from Boxley Parish Council, or would you prefer hear from the other councillors? Okay, thank you. So Councillor Hinder and then Councillor English. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. May I just firstly draw your attention to the large number of people in the public seats there. They are actually residents from Boxley, Boxley Village Society, who wanted to come along to listen to these proceedings. I draw your attention to them because the figures, when you look at the Avesome and the Fewsome figures for predicted traffic, we commissioned a traffic survey only 2 weeks ago. We wanted to get it as close to this hearing as possible to get the data, which has been supplied. And my goodness, there is a big difference between the figures that we've had from that survey and what is quoted in the two reports that are in the pack. The actual figures for 1 week was 57,618 vehicles passing through Boxley Village. And we've got all the data relevant to whether it's cars, lorries or whatever. And this was commissioned with a company that KCC uses. It highlights, we feel, that, and incidentally, we deliberately chose a week where there was no rail strikes, no school closures, no effects from the pandemic such as COVID. We wanted to try and highlight a normal week through Boxley Village. And when you think that the proposals that the developer are putting forward is that, well, we would perhaps alter Junction 4 of the M2. I see no guarantee as such at the moment that that will happen. And I do wonder if guarantees should be sought for that to happen. as they say, we will build 500 or 600 houses beforehand. What guarantee is there that after that's been done, that junction improvement will be made? In business, one seeks and gets assurances, financial assurances that these sorts of things will happen. Is that going to be the case here? Is the developer or the prospective construction companies that are going to build the houses going to put forward the financial rewards of financial money for the building of this junction? I see no evidence of that at present. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I bring in Councillor English next, please?
Thank you. I've had my differences with Kent Highways over the years, but I do listen very carefully to what they said today, and I have to say they've said most of what I was going to say, so I can be a little more brief. I think they speak from some experience about the dangers and risks of mitigation at certain times, because if you look at the existing Maidstone local plan, and I do think it's important to reference that, great play was made of having mitigation for the developments to the south of Maidstone and also to the development of Hermitage Lane, and that mitigation was never really pinned down. So what's happened is we've had the developer contributions, and then the mitigation has turned out to be undeliverable. So we've had a situation where we have had the development which has received planning permission later on because there was promised mitigation, and that mitigation has never ever been delivered, and we now have a county council that is struggling to find a way to actually deliver that promised mitigation. So we've got to be very, very careful with this process that we don't repeat those mistakes and we avoid bringing the whole process of local plan making into some degree of discredit with both developers, professionals and the wider public. I believe it's absolutely crucial that we nail down when the mitigation is going to happen, what the mitigation is going to be, and that mitigation can be delivered. Now, I agree that there is still going to be some work to be done to flesh out some of these details, and we don't know all the answers yet. But the further down the road, pun intended, we kick this tin can, the harder it's going to be. And what I particularly would not want to see is interim solutions that make the situation worse. I'm particularly concerned, and I have had many people contact me about the interim solution. I've seen a lot of interim solutions in planning over the years, and they tend to last rather longer in most cases than is predicted. And actually some of them turn out to be permanent solutions rather than interim ones. The last thing we want to do is have a long-standing interim solution that makes the situation worse, or even turns out to be the permanent situation. That would be awful. So in conclusion, I would say, as much as possible, we need to have a policy if this allocation is to be made sound, and at the moment I think we're still some way from that, which is actually saying, yes, this is what can be done to make this development acceptable within the meaning of the circular and within plan making. I have to say, I think we're still some way from that. I'm not saying it can't be done. I really am not. But I'm damn saying that there is work to be done and it needs to be nailed down. And the last thing we need to do is go away from a local plan review and saying all these details will be in an SPD or a subsequent document, because we all know that Maidstone Borough Council, like every other planning authority in the country, is calling out for planning officers. We're behind with so many things, so there's no guarantee as to when that document will ever deliver. Half the houses could have been built by the time we actually end up with an SPD. So please, let's not kick too many footballs down the road. I won't go into more detail because I think the other speakers have said those points.
Thank you for that. Can I just be clear, to Councillor Brindle or Councillor Shepherd want to add anything further to what Councillor Hinder has said? So I've obviously heard from Councillor Hinder with a Boxley hat on. I wondered if the Parish Council wanted to say anything further to what I've already heard, and then I'll bring in other people to follow. Yeah.
I'll be very brief. Boxley Parish Council agree totally with the comments made by Kent County Council, Bredhurst and Councillor English. Unlike people across the room from us, we have carried out a lot of community engagement over this since the last hearing, and particularly with the members of, as Bob said, the Boxley Village Society, who are in the audience at the back, who have come to many meetings with us. And the thing I'd like to really highlight for the people that haven't been to Boxley, which it seems many people haven't, the single road through the village is used every day as a rat run for commuters and commercial vehicles. And it's also identified by sat-navs as the north-south route from Lidsing down to Maidstone through the North Downs. The road is totally inadequate and does not meet the recommended unobstructed widths for two-way traffic. The standard normal traffic, including buses and HGVs, is 6.75 metres. Restricted cars and light vehicles is 5.5 metres. In Boxley, right in the centre of Boxley, opposite the, between the Church Hall and the King's Arms, it's 4.5 metres. That is 2 metres shorter than what the legal requirements are. This is a medieval village that was mentioned in the Domesday Book. Many of the houses in the centre of Boxley are listed, and there is no, I cannot see any mitigation other than, I was expecting to hear mitigation at this meeting. I've heard nothing so far, but I would like to draw the fact that this is an area of outstanding natural beauty, and the increased traffic, noise and pollution that will come with the Lidsing development will be just unbearable. Boxley Village Society and Boxley Parish Council completely oppose Lidsing Garden community development in the local PAN, as there's been inadequate consideration or any consideration on the substantial adverse environment impact of Boxley Village.
Thank you. Is it Councillor Brindle next, or? Yep.
Thank you, sir. Most of what I was going to say has been said by others this morning, afternoon, so I will just concentrate on some of the figures from the survey that we've had undertaken. I have here, which I've printed off for you, some data should you wish to have it. It's available to anybody who wants to view it. We also have a photograph of an HGV that took up the whole of the road last week. It meant that a car travelling north through the village had to mount the pavement so that the lorry could get through. Part of this survey has identified that a total for the week period of 255 HGVs ranging from 4-axle trucks to 6-axle trucks with trailers were counted travelling through Boxley Village. And as my colleague here has said, that is it is impossible in some places to even get that size of vehicle through. Of these 255 HGVs, 4 were of the larger, heavier vehicles using the narrow roads through this ancient village, where I should mention that because it's, as has been mentioned, an ancient village, a lot of the listed buildings face exactly onto the front with no pavements at all. As has previously been mentioned, the traffic service recently commissioned by Boxley Parish Council shows an increase in traffic through the village of 7,892 to a total of 56,418 vehicle movements in a week, which equates to 8,059 per day. These figures, if we expand this number and calculate the annual flow through Boxley Village, without any mitigation measures in place or identified, This equates to, are you ready for this? 2,996,136 vehicle movements on this, which is a country lane, which is not identified as being part of the strategic road network. I should also add that Boxley does not have street lighting. So in your question Q11, SQ11, you advise that existing modelling and assessment had not been considered a maximised approach to deter vehicle movements south of the M2, and that further measures could be contemplated to address residual effects. We fully concur with other speakers that have been speakers from KCC and others on this side of the room. We can find nothing put forward to date, and as such we question the soundness of a plan that has not considered measures to deter or mitigate in any major form the north-south traffic and protect the conservation area of Boxley Village. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Can I next hear from, is it CPRE Kent, and then I'll bring in Mr. Mosley and then Medway Council.
Thank you. I'm finding myself that I have absolutely nothing extra to add to the very detailed discussions at the moment, so I wanted to support what KCC have said and the parish councils, what they've said too. Thank you.
Mr. Mosley, please.
Thank you, sir. We find ourselves in a situation where a lot of the parties around the table raised concerns at Regulation 19 stage around the shortcomings of the highway work that supported the local plan. Obviously, the council took the decision to advance the local plan to submission and examination without addressing those concerns. And we find ourselves now presented with volumes of additional evidence in relation to highway impacts, changes in mitigation strategy, and I think an acknowledgement, certainly by Kent County Council as local highway authority, that there is additional work needed. I would suggest that those are actually shortcomings in terms of the evidence being presented before you, rather than the need for additional work. It's the fact that that work hasn't been done and you're not being presented with schemes of mitigation. What we haven't been presented with either, sir, is really up-to-date statements of common ground from National Highways and Kent County Council in relation to the modifications and whether or not those modifications are deemed to be acceptable to the council. We obviously heard today Kent County Council's position on that in terms of what they're advancing as main modifications, but surely one of the purposes of the duty to cooperate is for those public bodies to agree what policy is being advanced, not necessarily, sir, to come to today's hearing session and really we are in danger of making policy on the fly. I think another element, sir, is Medway Council and the duty to cooperate. I appreciate your part one findings, which were obviously in relation to the work undertaken to date, but again we're looking at a situation where some of the mitigation needed is to be delivered within adjacent authorities or needs the adjacent authorities' cooperation to deliver, and yet we have no statement of common ground with Medway Council. So again it questions whether or not that is actually deliverable. And particularly, sir, in relation to the East-West link, which you'll appreciate from the evidence you've heard today, significant weight has been afforded in terms of its ability to manage impacts on the wider road network. And again, sir, not wishing to repeat myself from earlier today, but in relation to viability, the monitor and manage approach requires specific deliverable and costed measures. They are required to be viable and capable of implementation. Again, we have not been presented with any updated viability assessment, so you'll note that the housing trajectory, including this site, has been changed quite significantly in terms of we are now faced with a completely different potential phasing approach, none of which is represented within the viability work, sir, and I would point you to the viability assessment and in particular page 397, which really only accounts for viability or infrastructure funding from year 6 of the development, and again, only a rate of 4.14 million per annum. We have no clear understanding of what that would actually deliver in reality, not in only in relation to highways, but the whole range of infrastructure that this scheme needs to deliver to be sustainable and deliver the garden community objectives. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And Ms. Smith for Medway Council, please.
Thank you, sir. Sorry. Thank you, sir. Medway shares many of the concerns that have been raised this afternoon in relation to the certainty which can be provided by the evidence base which is being developed to date. And in particular, the ability for us as stakeholders to provide our effective participation with regards to views on the effectiveness of the mitigations presented. We share the concerns raised by others previously expressed this afternoon that the impacts are not clearly defined and identified within the additional work which is being done, and therefore it's difficult to draw certainty and conclusions that the mitigations can provide for an effective approach to deliver sustainable development. Medway has raised issues which have been responded to in the evidence-based work which is being presented, and presented in a way in which our requests were disproportionate to the level of evidence which should be required at this stage of the plan-making process. We continue to believe that our requests are not disproportionate. They are to provide certainty with regards to the impacts. Many of the issues which we raised in our earlier correspondence were to seek just to make sure that the work was done accurately, to address errors in the original work, and to provide information which is in the modelling already carried out, for example, in relation to queuing statistics. And that information in relation to queuing statistics is relevant to understand the delays at key junctions, queuing on slip roads, the strategic road network, and just allows us to provide an effective participation into the examination process. We're particularly concerned that this development in Maidstone is being promoted as suburban growth to Medway. I think everybody understands that suburban development often comes with a high level of car dependency. If the ambitions of the local authority and the wider stakeholders, including the developers, are to provide for sustainable development, sustainable transport is at the heart of that. And I think we want to see the confidence, the commitment and the certainty that this proposal can deliver sustainable growth, and transport has to be at the heart of that. We would share the comments raised by other parties, including Kent County Council, that we would want to see reference to the mitigation measures being made at the outset of the development, particularly critical in a suburban location, that unsustainable transport patterns are not developed from the outset, that the sustainable transport measures can be given the best possible means of being successful, and that means them being in place at the outset of the scheme. And similarly, we'd want to see reference in the policy and in the IDP to the need for off-site requirements. And just in response to the comment which Mr. Mosley has just made, just to confirm that there has been no further engagement with Medway on highway matters since the stage 1 hearings in relation to delivery of off-site delivery or the public transport measures, or an update to the statement of common ground. So our position is as previously reported to this examination, and so we really want to see the certainty delivered through this process that sustainable development can be delivered.
Thank you. And just so that I'm clear, from Medway Council's perspective, in terms of potential main modifications subject to the evidence, it's things like a reference to specific junction improvements within the Medway urban area where the evidence demonstrates that would be justified or necessary?
Yes, Inspector, we would want to see that certainty built in to the policy, so there's certainty on the delivery of those mitigations and understanding the impact, so we can work clearly with the neighbouring councils and with the land promoter to achieve the best for the area.
Thank you for those contributions. So if I can come back in the first instance to the council and the site promoter, there's a number of things there that I'd like you to respond on. I think the first is around, similarly, as I heard this morning, updates to the infrastructure development plan, the IDP that sits alongside the local plan, and that there may be implications in relation to Lidsing that would feed into that process. I'll then be interested to hear the council and site promoters' response to Mr. Wright's suite of proposed modifications in terms of the timing and the detail that could be embedded within the policy. The third area is in relation to the submissions from Bredhurst Parish Council, but I think also enveloped within submissions from others about this kind of lack of detail and lack of understanding in terms of the impact on communities, the highway network to the south of Lidsing, to inform what a potential mitigation strategy might look like. And then I think allied to Kent County Council's suggested modifications, I think linked into that, the point from Medway Council in terms of specificity around particular off-site highway improvements within their administrative area, given the relationship of this site to the Medway towns. So I'll hand that over to the council. You're going to kick off, Mr. Lewis, and then possibly others come in to help you.
No, thank you, sir, and thank you to everybody on the other side of the room who've clearly outlined some of their experiences, fears and concerns for what they foresee might happen in the future as a result of this development. And as per the discussions we had this morning, clearly there's things being said on the other side of the room about retaining control over the development process and how the development comes forward. And hearing Councillor English's experiences of elsewhere of losing that control. And this is the point we made this morning, that applying a monitor and manage framework to the IDP in the manner that Mr. Bown set out, with those essentials to have and those items that can be assessed throughout the life of the development in accordance with the circular. That does give that control back to all the parties. So Maidstone Borough Council have been working with a number of parties across their strategic sites to put together stewardship arrangements. And those arrangements will include the local communities. So from the experience we've already had with Monitor and Manage in Medway Innovation Park has a Monitor and Manage framework, and that's only just a short distance away from Lidsing, near Junction 3 of the M2. That Monitor and Manage process can allow significant control throughout the phases of the development. And I think that's what's been missing through the planning process and some of the experiences expressed today, so that should one of the phases of the development be assessed in detail, and monitoring manager allows for that detailed assessment, and that shows that there is a likely harm arising from the next phase of development, and that development has to deal with it, or no more development comes forward. So the circular should apply in this instance, and through the SPD and main modifications, the council is of the opinion that those safeguards and those protections that clearly are needed and expressed by local people can be enforced. And that also applies to the points being made by KCC as far as phasing. Yes, there will be some critical elements that are needed up front, and that can be dealt with through the IDP, and that whole process has been put forward in those main modifications.
Sorry, Mr. Lewis, can I just be clear on that final point? I understand a bit about the IDP, saying then that would flow through in terms of main modifications? No? Or the IDP would be alongside the wider main modification process?
So it would make sense to join the two up so we could have a bundle of documents, I would suggest. So the main modifications be accompanied by the IDP.
But in terms of this bundling approach, is the council going as... I mean, is today the first time you've heard Mr. Wright's points that he's made in terms of the sequencing and phasing? Are these discussions that have been having, or is the council of a view, we've got certain evidence, we're going with the proposed main modifications as far as they've currently been drafted, and we're not contemplating or looking at further changes along the lines that Mr. Wright outlined on behalf of the local highway authority? Mr. Wild first.
May I just pick up in terms of the question? I think the most pertinent one that arises from Mr. Wright's intervention on that point was the earlier delivery of the East-West link into phase one. I think that's what you're principally referring to. Just to provide some assurances, in terms of viability and deliverability, that is something that can come forward in that time scale. I'm not here obviously to speak on viability evidence, but if that's necessary to speak to colleagues, we just provide the confidence that that's something that can be done, and it can fall into that process. So it's not a challenge in that respect to embody that modification, should it be considered appropriate in the discussions with KCC on the main modifications. That's hopefully helps you a little bit in ability to do so.
Thank you, Mr. Wild. I mean, I'm mindful it's Maidstone's plan. I mean, I don't know if Mr. Coyne or Mr. Edgerton want to come in on this point.
Thank you, sir. Yes, we have actually been making very good progress with Kent County Council regarding potential main modifications. So we are in a good position, and what I would say is there's a few issues we just need to resolve around timing, for example. So there is still a little bit of work to do, but most of the progress has already been made, so we are in a strong position. Thank you.
So we remain confident that these main modifications will be ready by the end of the hearings.
Coyne, you're competing with traffic in my...
Sorry, just to say, sir, we're confident that we can have these main modifications, as we said this morning, that these as well will be ready for the end of the hearings.
Thank you. I'm taking this all in to feed into my post stage 2 deliberations. On the further points, I mean, that's picking up Kent County Council's submissions along similar lines, and I've heard previously from Medway about their concerns about the impact on their highway network. The request again for further, I think, specificity within the policy in terms of off-site mitigation within the Medway urban area. Is there the evidence that would support that, and is it necessary in the council's view for plan soundness?
Maybe I could just pick up the point of the evidence to support it, and then pass back to the council with respect to the. So yes, the earlier transport assessment work that you saw submitted prior to stage 1 did identify and has responded to as well from comments from Medway about a screening approach, a list of junctions that are deemed to require mitigation, with specifics in location and with indications of form of that mitigation. As you correctly identified, the specifics of the detail are to follow, but there certainly is the evidence to support where that mitigation might be, should it be appropriate to include it within the main modifications.
And if I may add, I believe that Medway Council would be part of the process of bringing sites forward in future, so that Monitor and Manage Framework Working Group, they would be party to that as well.
Thank you. Mr. Coyne, please.
So just to confirm that we have attempted since stage 1 to liaise with Medway to update the statements of common ground. We completely realise that we've been in sort of difficult territory with local elections and all of that, and that's passed now. So we will absolutely engage with Medway now to do that work. But we have attempted to do this. I think it's important here. We've heard a lot in this session about engagement. So I don't think there's been any attempt on behalf of the council or indeed the promoter not to engage. I think we've spoken before here that it's often very, very difficult with schemes of this nature to actually secure positive engagement at certain phases because people in communities are fearful of engagement being almost perceived as capitulation. And that was one of the key reasons that we've developed the sort of approach with the SPDs and the governance framework for the SPDs to make sure that there are seats around the table as we develop that for parish representatives, for a Medway cabinet member, a Medway parish representative, because we know that if we're to make new development and existing developments sit well together and talk to each other, as it were, that we need that engagement.
Okay, and then is it an additional sort of point that logically flows on, Ms. Thomas?
It is. Just going to say that yes, we have made quite a lot of progress with Kent County Council on the wording of main mods already, which is obviously what Mr. Edgerton has said. But I'd also like to say that from what Medway said just now, we do have confidence that we can find a form of words that can give them the certainty that they're looking for in the delivery of any necessary mitigation. And I think it would be I'd like to say, positively, that obviously we want to achieve the same thing.
And then finally, I'm not losing sight of the points that was raised by Bredhurst and others in terms of there's a lack of analysis, there's a lack of detail in terms of understanding the impact of this proposed allocation on the road network to the south of Lidsing, primarily in the Bredhurst and Boxley parish. I don't know, Mr. Wild, as obviously your company has done a lot of the technical work, whether you wish to respond to that point, please.
Certainly, thanks for the invitation to do so. I think it's important to highlight that it's not a deficiency of evidence. I think actually Mr. Shattuck made some very generous comments regarding our transparency and honesty within the assessment, but I think maybe it should be viewed in a different way, and that the evidence has adopted a very robust approach in terms of forecasting what the impact will be, and that's been documented comprehensively through the evidence base. But going on and considering mitigation, it also adopts a precautionary approach insofar as there is inherently uncertainty in any forecasting, and it would be wrong to, I think, to sit here and claim with absolute certainty there would be no impact in those areas. So therefore, bringing forward policy requirements to consider the possibility of traffic calming and other interventions to work in harmony with the delivery of the Eastern Link Road is appropriate. And I think that's where the transparency and honesty is in the evidence base, that it looks at that and it sets a framework to implement that process. Now, the phrase monitor and manage has been sort of tied to that one, as it has to others, but I think it's important to draw a slight distinction between the monitor and manage that we talk about with respect to traffic calming and that which is talked about in the circular that's emerged. One is really about monitoring trip rates and trip generation and sustainability. With respect to the traffic calming, it's about monitoring the impact of the mitigation of the link road, of the development in a localised and specific area, and then responding in a proportionate way which works with the community to find the most effective solution. And it would be presumptuous and inappropriate to get to the point of specificity on those measures for many of the reasons that I think have been raised about concerns about what form that might take, how it might impact on individual properties or particular areas of the community. So it's quite appropriate that that is all brought into the mix. But it's important to note that this isn't an absence of evidence. It's simply the evidence suggests, as sort of validated through an exercise of correlating with the second model sets from KCC, that there is justifiably an anticipated benefit from the East-West Link Road, which will, from a purely logical point of view, running parallel to Bredhurst, derive significant betterment over the existing condition and the forecast situation, but it could benefit from complementary interventions in that area. And it's really appropriate that we assess that as the scheme progresses and engage with the community to find the best approach as we have clarity on the utilisation of those routes. So I think possibly your own question in SQ11 probably hit the nail on the head really in that respect, which is the assessment doesn't apply the full stick, but there is an approach to bring that in more aggressively if the carrot isn't as successful as we all would hope. Hopefully that assists.
Thank you for that. We're coming up to 3:45, so I'm going to take a mid-afternoon adjournment. I think I'm going to bring this highway session to its conclusion. So kind of thank everybody for their contributions in terms of the discussion this afternoon. As I say, I've got your written material before me as well that carries equal weight to what I've heard in the room this afternoon. There's certainly food for thought that's going to feed into my post-stage hearings advice to the Borough Council. So kind of thank everybody. We're going to have a 15-minute adjournment. So I'm going to be back in this room at 4 o'clock to then pick up the final part of this afternoon's discussion, which is in relation to habitat regulations as they relate to the North Downs Woodlands Special Area of Conservation. Thank you.
Not really. No, actively. I've just been asked if I can to stay around in case anything arises, just in terms of I'm not briefed on it, but I said I'll just stay in case. But I'm not proposing to introduce myself even. I'm not planning to unless yeah, exactly. Yeah, we're not planning to say anything really. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. The right one. Yes. Well, I should imagine it should. Yeah. With expert. Yeah. Just like that. Get one through. Yeah.
Okay, that's clock signals. It's 4 o'clock, so I'll resume this afternoon's hearing, and we're on the penultimate item on my agenda for this afternoon, and it was seeking an update from the council in relation to air quality and the habitat regulations. I think I made clear in my agenda, and I just caveat this session, this is a habitat regulation issue. It's not, as I understand it, exclusive to Lidsing, but this is a convenient, I think, point to just check with the council in terms of where we are on this issue. I'd obviously received 2 documents, ED 77 and ED 78, the former being a helpful update note from the council at the end of March, and ED 78 I think being further work by Jacobs. I had no specific supplementary questions on this, but obviously it's been a live issue. I think during the examination it sort of still remained live at the end of the stage 1 hearings. All the evidence before me in terms of what I've got from Natural England and from the council seems to be pointing in a positive direction, but as I sit here now, I'm not sure yet that there's kind of been a final kind of agreement or acceptance in terms of where that work would take us, in terms of whether potential mitigation may be required, where there is possible exceedance of the limit. So I'll invite the council in the first instance for a further update, please.
Yes, thank you, sir. If I start, and we've got 2 colleagues from the council and from Jacobs that will help as well, if that's okay. So you'll know, sir, that we recently signed a statement of common ground with Natural England, which confirmed that they were satisfied with where we were on the nutrient neutrality solution that we discussed this morning, and that work on sort of the air quality issues around the ancient woodland was ongoing. This is confirmed furthermore in the Natural England response to the supplementary questions. Initially, we had thought that we were going to be below the 1% screening threshold for nitrogen deposition, but in the event when we got the work back, there was a slight exceedance when you looked at the local plan review alone scenario. Now, albeit this is a largely hypothetical scenario, because the local plan review alone is very unlikely to happen. So we advised Natural England, we met with Natural England and advised them of this exceedance, and we advised them that the promoters were carrying out an ecology assessment, but the problem was that this, because of the seasonal issues, that this wouldn't be ready for the hearings, this wouldn't be completed for the hearings. What the ecology assessment will do will be to look at the composition and the species within the affected area of the woodland in order to ascertain whether or not there is a significant impact. On the basis that this wouldn't be ready for the hearings, and we as the planning authority wanted to make sure we were being proactive here, we met again with Natural England to agree a direction of travel. So effectively, and notwithstanding that we don't yet know whether we will actually need mitigations, we updated the statement of common ground, and we developed a suite of mitigations. And this was on the basis that when we know more about what the development pattern at Lidsing is likely to be, the more detailed development pattern, things like the configuration of the estate roads and the likely impact on traffic runs and stuff like that, that we could then look at this suite of mitigations and see if there is an exceedance, what the sort of best solutions are. This is an approach that's recently been found sound as part of the Epping Forest local plan, and Eric can talk more about that if you need him to, sir. Also, at Natural England's request, LUC, who are also at the table with us today, our sustainability consultants, have updated the HRA addendum, and this will be going to Natural England shortly. So at the moment, we are assuming through that work that we will need mitigations. The updated statement of common ground has been provided to Natural England. The highlighting the suite of mitigations and what they might look like, and we have talked these through with them. The HRA addendum, as I say, will go to them imminently. We are in the process of commissioning Jacobs to do a high-level review of the mitigations proportionate to this stage in the plan-making process, to confirm to us that they are mitigations that, if we draw upon them, they are capable of being effectively modelled in order that we can scientifically demonstrate their efficacy. And so that's where we are with Natural England. They are happy with the general approach. We talked a few minutes ago about the governance frameworks for the garden communities, and we've got a stakeholder governance group and technical governance group, and Natural England are aware that we anticipate them being part of that, and I suppose that is effectively where we are. We do foresee, sir, that we will probably need a main modification to reflect where we are and to describe the process that we will do in terms of engaging Natural England at the SPD and detailed planning application stage, so that if mitigations are required and they need to be signed off, that they are done so to the satisfaction of Natural England at that time.
Thank you. And to assist me at this point, in terms of a potential main modification, is that likely to the sort of the natural environment policy, or would it be a specific main modification for the Lidsing policy? Thank you. Obviously, without prejudice to kind of what the detail of that modification would look like. You referenced Epping Forest. I think that's recently been found sound. Shame on me, I haven't read the report or looked at the plan yet, but I mean, there's a general gist of what that's saying. I think you referred, Mr. Coyne, you've got a colleague who might be able to illuminate me on that. Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you, sir. So just for context, the Epping Forest District Local Plan was adopted on 6th of March 2023. So the inspector's report was issued in February 2023. So it is a relatively recent plan that's come into force. There was a number of modifications arising throughout the plan examination process, but they have arrived at a position working with Natural England. So I think it's in the same way that we've engaged positively with Natural England and other relevant stakeholders to get to an agreed position. I think one of the key tenets of the Epping Forest example, now we have to respect that there are unique local circumstances and differences in terms of the overall strategies, but it's taking a precautionary principle there. So it's making clear that development won't be permitted where it's not possible to conclude that there will be no adverse impact or no adverse effect on the integrity of the SAC, either alone or in combination. But subsequent to that, there's also a series of mitigations that may be deployed as appropriate, whether on or off site later down in the process. So there is a sequencing there, which I think captures the spirit of what we would seek to achieve with this plan. I think the other thing that's worth noting there is that there is a number of strategies that Epping Forest has prepared. They're corporate strategies, but in part they deal with the SAC there as well. One of those strategies is, and so whilst the inspector for those examination hearings recognized that they weren't development plan documents in their own right and didn't carry weight as such, what they did do were provide a good benchmarking basis for how you would approach the future management of development in the area. One of those documents is an air pollution mitigation strategy, and what we've done is drawn a number of our proposed mitigations. That is the package of mitigations that we put forward to Natural England. We've drawn on that, but also added some additional mitigations which we think are specific to our local circumstances. And so, as my colleague Phil mentioned, these are under review by Natural England through a proposed update to the Statement of Common Ground in draft format. But we think this is an appropriate basis on which to proceed given the precedent that is already there. Thank you.
So if I might just sort of conclude, sir, our intention would be that for the session that you've got planned on the 9th would be that by that time we would have Jacob's initial view on the sort of efficacy of the mitigations, albeit at a sort of high level proportionate to this stage in the process. We would hope to have an updated statement of common ground with Natural England at that time, and we would have the draft main mod for discussion with you.
Thank you. And the output of that would then obviously feed into, if it generates a main modification, is it Mr. Pearson from LUC's update to the habitat regulations? So presumably is the intention to kind of produce an addendum to the existing body of habitat regulation assessment work that contemplates and reflects on the main modifications?
I think that's right. So yeah, I mean, we've already produced an addendum, which was back in March, and yes, our intention would be to produce a further addendum based on the latest position. Yeah.
As I sit here now, it sounds that Lidsing would be screened in as having given rise to potential likely effect on the integrity of. So covering both eventualities. Yeah. Yeah, I just final sort of, it seems just a quirk that it's the local plan review in isolation that triggers the potentially adverse effect rather than sort of in combination with other.
This has been explained to me, and it does seem to be a quirk of the numbers. I don't know if Ms. Shara would be able to help us with that, sir. As I say, it was explained to me, and I didn't understand it, so but that doesn't mean anything.
I can, from an air quality perspective, just provide a very high-level overview of that. But each scenario had different trip factors. So in the do-nothing scenario, the trip rates along Boxley Road, where we have the problem, were higher in the do-nothing scenario than they were in the do-something. So the change didn't go over that 1%. Whereas in the do-minimum, compared to the do-something, because of the committed developments included in the do minimum traffic data, and also developments which were highly likely to be built were included in that. The traffic levels on Boxley Road were lower, so the difference between the do something and the do minimum were greater, which tipped it over the 1%.
It does seem an interesting outcome from that process. But as you say, obviously others are now looking at that, and it'll be sort of investigated further. That's helpful for me. I think I'll see what's coming sort of down the track and how that can kind of fit into moving the plan examination forward. The session was obviously primarily an opportunity for the council to update me. I presume other people around the room for interest in habitat regulations or the particular points people want to make. No.
So no, we were just staying in case there was an issue that you needed clarification on, so we're not proposing to make any points.
Likewise, government policy is always very clear with the statutory consultees. We remain in our own bubble, but we take notice of other people's, representation. So if something came forward from Natural England saying National Highways, you must do something, then obviously we take notice. But on these matters, we always leave it to the appropriate statutory consultee.
I mean, that's just sort of prompted me to think. Some people have obviously referred to in terms of air quality and traffic more generally in relation to this part of the borough, potential impacts from the Lower Thames crossing. I know we briefly touched on that in stage 1. Have things materially changed in relation to that project, and does it have any bearing on the air quality issue as it pertains specifically to the local plan review as an in-combination effect?
I don't believe they have, sir, in that the Lower Thames Crossing haven't done any of the sort of air quality modelling for their impacts yet. So in the absence of that, it's very difficult for others to model it.
Thank you. I've got no further questions on habitat regulations. I think in terms of final item on my agenda, in terms of clarification regarding potential main modifications, I a number have obviously been discussed today. It sounds, from what I'm hearing, both in relation to Heathlands and Lidsing, that further main modifications are sort of in the ether, being worked on as we speak. I've certainly probably have something to say about that as part of my sort of post-stage 2 observations or findings in terms of moving things forward, specifically around particularly the timings or the points at which particular interventions or mitigations come into effect through the policy. I appreciate the policies both for Heathlands and Lidsing have been modified as we've been going along, so there's a lot more detail in them on the sort of the phasing and trigger points for infrastructure, but I think there's probably some further evolution and refinement to those aspects of the policy. I think that concludes for me for today. So again, can I thank everybody who's participated in today's discussion. We have got a further hearing session tomorrow afternoon in relation to the final strategic policies for this fortnight of sitting, and obviously I've got a site visit first thing, which I think somebody from the council is going to meet me on site, I think, at Abbygate Place. Yeah. In which case I'll probably see the council back here at 2 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. Thank you, everybody.